Sean Diddy Combs isn't just fighting for his freedom, he's fighting to hold on to his fortune. Forbes now estimates his net worth is $400 million, a significant drop from the $740 million valuation just a few years ago. But that number could shrink even more. Federal prosecutors are moving to seize assets tied to the alleged criminal activity.
It didn't happen with a bang. There was no dramatic announcement, no emergency press conference, no moment where everything suddenly froze on camera. It happened the way real downfalls always happen.
Once considered a billionaire with a vodka line, a TV network, and a clothing brand, Sean Combs' fortune has taken a major hit. Forbes estimates his net worth is roughly $400 million, nearly half of what it was just a few years ago. Both his Beverly Hills and Miami mansions were raided in March of 2024 as part of the investigation into his alleged crimes. And that number may continue to drop as Combs faces a federal trial and a Justice Department forfeiture action that could cost him his empire. An empire that prosecutors allege was built, at least in part, through a pattern of criminal activity, including alleged sex trafficking, drug distribution, and violence, all used to advance what they call a racketeering enterprise. In the unsealed indictment, prosecutors outline how his business and personal assets allegedly played a role in carrying out or concealing the crimes. This means any assets connected to the behavior, even indirectly, could be seized, including real estate, companies, vehicles, and aircrafts. Now, his $60 million private jet has reportedly already been sold. The Beverly Hills estate is currently on the market for $61 million. And while Combs still owns his $48 million Miami mansion, a judge denied his request to use it as collateral for bond. In week 2 of testimony, Homeland Security Special Agent Gannon took the stand. Gannon, who helped lead the March raids of Combs' homes, walked jurors through photos of the items seized. Among them, parts of AR-15 style rifles with the serial number scratched off, loaded magazines, a Gucci bag reportedly filled with ketamine and MDMA, and personal items like lingerie and dozens of bottles of baby oil and lubricant. Prosecutors say this evidence is critical to establishing the elements required under federal racketeering laws, helping them show a pattern of alleged crime, criminal behavior used to sustain or conceal the enterprise. In an effort to protect what's left of his assets, Combs hired Stefan Casella, former deputy chief of the Justice Department's asset forfeiture and money laundering section, to fight the forfeiture action. If the jury finds Combs guilty, it will be up to them to determine how much of Combs' assets are subject to forfeiture. Anything forfeited after a conviction could be used to support alleged victims. Sean Combs denies all allegations. And to help us break down what's at stake, I'm joined by Jim Trusty. He's the former chief of the Department of Justice, Organized Crime and Gang Section. Jim, thank you so much for coming on today.
Sure. Good to be here.
So, Jim, let's start with the forfeiture. This isn't just about prison time anymore. Prosecutors want his empire. From what you've seen in the filings, how aggressive is this?
Well, it looks to be very aggressive, and there's a couple of reasons I say that. The first is it's very broadly worded. What they're talking about is essentially any property, real or personal, that could constitute either facilitating property or instrumentalities, they call it, or proceeds. And so that's kind of the whole business empire of P. Diddy being at risk. And that's the second part, which is it's a RICO case, a criminal enterprise case, where they've defined the organization, the criminal enterprise, as not just Sean Combs, but as all these business interests that he has, including liquor.
Quietly, relentlessly, and without mercy. One day the machine was still moving, still breathing, still pretending. The next day, it was running on fumes, and nobody wanted to admit it out loud. For years, the illusion of endless money created a sense of invincibility. When revenue flows nonstop, mistakes feel harmless, excess feels justified, warnings get ignored. The belief sets in that the well can never run dry. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming. Streams that once poured cash slowed to a trickle. Deals that once guaranteed returns stopped renewing. Promises were made on the assumption that tomorrow would always look like yesterday. Then tomorrow arrived, and nothing came in. Zero is not a small number. Zero is violent. Zero means there's no cushion. Zero means every expense hits harder. Zero means the past comes back demanding payment with interest. When revenue drops to zero, It doesn't just change finances, it rewrites reality. The first reactions weren't public.
Story in a RICO case. You don't just focus on a particular moment in time or a crime. You tell the whole story of this criminal enterprise, which lends itself to big forfeiture moments. And so it's not totally unusual to see it this broadly worded. What I think is a little unusual is it's not very specific in terms of any preliminary seizures. It looks like they haven't actually seized anything yet, even though they executed search warrants and looked for evidence of things. And so a lot of times you'll see listings in there of bank accounts, automobiles, jets, whatever, that the government has already preliminarily seized to make sure it's still going to be available at the time they do a forfeiture hearing. So this one, it's a blank slate. And it's blank enough where if you're the defense attorney and you get to this next phase, which, by the way, is supposed to be with the same jury. They may not know that yet. But that second phase would be one where you really would say to the judge, I don't have any notice here, Your Honor. This is so broadly worded. I need to particularize it, have a chance to digest it, and perhaps bring in expert testimony on both sides about kind of legitimate sources of income versus illegitimate ones.
And you mentioned that, they're also linking his company. So maybe that's his, record studio, or maybe that's, his vodka line. But how does something like a vodka line, how can that potentially even be mixed up with this? How can they say that that's linked to an alleged crime?
Yeah, it's really one of two or maybe even three ways. One is if there's somehow a tie-in where that property, that business was used to facilitate the freak-offs that are in the indictment, for instance, or obstructionist behavior. So if they literally used a record studio for a party and the record studio belonged to one of his companies, you could say that actually facilitated or was an instrumentality to support the criminal conduct. The other way is essentially if it is a proceed, if it was essentially built on money that comes from illegal activity. And then thirdly, and this is where it gets really crazy confusing, so I'll keep it short. Sometimes there's something called substitute assets where the government says, okay, we realize that particular asset, that car, that piece of art was not actually bought by proceeds or served to contribute to the crime. But because we can't find enough to satisfy the overall amount we're owed, we're going to take it as a substitute asset. It's a very government-friendly area, this whole idea of federal forfeiture. And again, I think they're in a position where they might have their mitts on almost anything he's ever touched.
And how do they decide just that number that they're looking for? Is there kind of like a flat out number that the government, when charging with these types of cases, that they say, hey, we're looking for 50 million, we're looking for 60 million. How do they decide how much?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, that is an easier task in some circumstances where you have a fraud situation where you can tell the amount of victimization and say, well, look, it adds up to 2.5 million, and they put that in the forfeiture indictment. They don't have that here. In a drug case, for instance, you might say, well, they were responsible for 10 kilograms of cocaine. A kilogram's about 30,000. So we're looking for 3 million, do the math. Here, it's much more wide open. I think you're looking at an actual trial within a trial, if we get to the forfeiture phase, where there's going to be experts saying this is money that's untouched by any sort of criminal enterprise from the defense side, and maybe a forensic auditor from the FBI saying, here's why we're entitled to all these types of proceeds or instruments. So it is a wide open battlefield. It's going to be kind of a textbook example of how deep the government tries to reach for forfeiture if they get to that point.
At what point does that kind of strategy from prosecutors become legally risky for them, though?
That's the thing. I mean, the court of public opinion every now and then turns on forfeiture. And, the idea of forfeiture is that you don't want people to not just get away with crime, but profit from it.
They were private. Phone calls that didn't get returned. Meetings that were postponed indefinitely. People who once stayed close suddenly found reasons to keep their distance. Loyalty, it turns out, is expensive, and when the money disappears, loyalty becomes optional. What made the situation so devastating wasn't just the loss of income, it was how fast everything connected to it collapsed. Properties that once symbolized success turned into financial sinkholes. Staff that once kept everything running became impossible to maintain. Security, travel, upkeep, all built for a life fueled by constant cash flow, started draining what little was left. Every day without revenue turned into a countdown. There was no secret reserve waiting to be unlocked, no emergency escape hatch. The belief that there was always more turned out to be the biggest lie of all. Years of unchecked spending had burned through everything. When the money stopped, there was nothing left to soften the fall. And that's when the panic became real. Influence doesn't exist without money, power doesn't survive without leverage.
Being criminally prosecuted and put in prison doesn't mean that you've lost the assets. And so the idea is to kind of make things even, to hold people accountable, to not let them profit from criminal activity. But over time, you see abuses. You see situations where a person barely had a role in some sort of criminal conspiracy. I mean, literally was on the job for one day and is ordered to forfeit millions of dollars. And that bubbles up to the Supreme Court, where they say this is just not totally fair. So there are abuses of the forfeiture system that are seen from time to time. I think, look, if P. Diddy, if Sean Combs is convicted in this case, I don't think he's going to necessarily gin up a ton of sympathy. But there may be legal observers that say, hey, this is a broad, overreaching moment, when they try to collect every single penny that a guy who obviously had legitimate income over long periods of his life.
And for those that do say, hey, isn't this just a financial overreach? How do prosecutors justify that?
Yeah, I think they justify it by saying, in this case, they'll say, look, two things. Number one, we didn't disable him financially pre-trial. We haven't actually locked into his accounts and taken things and frozen things where it might even affect his ability to hire attorneys or hire experts. And secondly, they say, look, it's a criminal enterprise that extended for a number of years, that where he had financial profit from this kind of power and control over an enterprise. So I don't expect them to be apologetic. I mean, they may end up showing moments of moderation where they say, well, we're not going to go after this company or that company, but they've left it all on the table for now, where they can do a very broad, deeply reaching process if they want to.
And Sean Combs, he's already sold one jet. The Beverly Hills mansion of his is on the market for $61 million or so. Does that seem like someone who is confident that they'll walk, or could that work for or against him in court?
It's probably not going to be anything that's particularly admissible during the trial. It could come up during the forfeiture just to show that, his overall stock has dropped. I mean, I think he's down to his last 400 million. It's a real tough spot to be in. But but I think at the end of the day, you really can't draw any firm conclusions. He knows he's got a battle of his life going on right now. I mean, this is a life eligible racketeering case. Doesn't mean he'll necessarily get life. It's not a mandatory sentence. But if the facts continue to be established of years of abusive and controlling behavior, it paints a pretty dark picture for him in terms of sentencing.
And Sean Combs, he's now brought in Mr. Casella, someone who literally wrote the book on asset forfeiture. What's Casella's role likely to be here?
Well, I worked with Steph at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland for years. He is literally the expert on forfeiture. Whenever I have a situation in private practice where I have a question mark about forfeiture, that poor guy has to take my phone call. So he's a great pick. He knows what he's doing. He knows both the process and the law, which can be a little bit different sometimes. I think he's probably, getting them prepared for the types of challenges. And by the way, I don't know this from him, but I would guess that he's basically figuring out what are the types of challenges we could raise in a forfeiture phase. What are the deficiencies in the government's approach? In other words, are they not discounting lawful employment by Sean Combs? And frankly, some of it could even relate to like how he's spending money right now. When you have a broad forfeiture allegation, it's kind of hard to figure out, are they saying that I can't get attorneys of my choosing because I'm using proceeds of criminal activities? So I think he's probably giving a lot of very sage guidance on how they walk through this process.
This appears the moment people realize there's nothing left to lose. Once word spread internally that the income had completely dried up, the entire atmosphere shifted, confidence vanished, control slipped, decisions became reactive, desperate, rushed. Silence replaced noise. And silence speaks volumes. The collapse wasn't caused by one mistake. It was the result of a system built on the assumption that consequences would never arrive. When that assumption failed, everything failed with it. The empire wasn't taken down by enemies. It wasn't destroyed by rivals. It collapsed under its own weight. What followed was a slow, humiliating unraveling. Assets couldn't be liquidated fast enough. Obligations stacked up faster than solutions. Every move created another problem. Every delay made things worse. Zero revenue meant zero margin for error. The psychological toll was just as severe. Identity had been tied to wealth, control.
dealing with a very broad, very deep, potentially deep-reaching forfeiture.
Since he is so knowledgeable, and since, I don't know if there's anyone who's more knowledgeable than him in this specific department, do you think that bringing him in may challenge the government's playbook at all?
I think it would certainly give them a moment of pause. Look, the reality is there's probably not a ton of time being spent worrying about forfeiture quite yet. They're probably figuring we'll get there when we get there. We got to try to get a conviction. But yeah, it's a shot across the bow. You see Steph Casella lining up on the other side, and you can say this about a lot of different type of expert witnesses and things where you say, wow, that's the king of DNA or the queen of forensic fingerprint recovery. So, I think it's a shot across the bow. They'll realize that they've got somebody that really knows their stuff on the other side, but that doesn't necessarily mean they change their approach in any way at this point.
And there's this idea of facilitating property, that a business or maybe an item helped enable a crime. How direct does that link need to be?
Yeah, we should ask Steph. but yeah, that's a great question. You have to be able to show, a significant link. It can't be just like this 6 steps removed kind of thing. Like there was a bottle of liquor that happened to be on the bar during one of these assaults, and he owns a liquor company, so therefore, the liquor we can presume facilitated the crime. You're going to have some, quantum of proof that's deeper than that. But it's very fact specific, and again, that's why I think you're probably looking. Even though a lot of times forfeiture becomes a very small afterthought to a criminal trial, this one really has the potential to be a completely independent kind of mini trial, delving into his finances, delving into issues just like that, like how well connected can the government make these instrumentalities, these facilitating pieces of property. I think it's inherently pretty difficult, but again, if you use a location, that's a little bit easier. If you say I'm going to use my liquor company headquarters, or I'm going to use a record business studio to have one of these freak offs, that becomes a much tougher climb for the defense to get out of it as an instrumentality. It's these kind of third time removed ones where they might have some success.
And like you said, we're not just talking about past behavior here. Prosecutors say that this was ongoing. Does that make asset recovery just a little bit easier for them?
Yeah, in general, I'd say yes. Because you're talking about a period of years, and you're going to have, during these trials, you're going to have very specific stories from witnesses that say, I was there when X happened at this particular location. But you're probably going to get broad characterizations too. Like he would always, use his liquor to get people drunk before these freak offs, or there were times where we met and discussed how we were going to do this at office X or home Y, or how planes were used. It might not be a specific moment, but he might have somebody that says, I was at the airport when his private plane brought prostitutes here. So you might not have the precision that you'd have with kind of a single event trial, but you're probably going to have pretty significant stories that, again, tie these properties into the possibility of being forfeited.
How much of a role does public perception play here? Have we seen the DOJ make strategic decisions based on headlines?
Well, overall, sure. We could probably point to all sorts of cases that you could, I think, fairly characterize as a little bit of trophy hunting, where the Department of Justice or even
and excess. Without money, that identity shattered. The confidence that once filled rooms evaporated. What remained was pressure, fear, and the realization that the image no longer matched reality. Those watching from the outside began noticing the signs, the absence, the lack of activity, the sudden disappearance from spaces where presence was once guaranteed. When money vanishes, visibility fades. When visibility fades, myths die. This wasn't a temporary setback. This wasn't a rough patch. This was total financial collapse. The kind you don't bounce back from quietly. Rebuilding from zero requires trust, and trust doesn't survive a downfall like this easily. Every potential partner hesitates. Every opportunity comes with strings attached. Every door that once opened automatically now stays closed. For years, the lifestyle was built on constant inflow, endless streams feeding one massive operation: music, brands, partnerships, appearances, influence. It all worked as long as money kept circulating. As long as cash kept entering, the system looked unstoppable. But systems like that don't collapse overnight. They rock quietly from
decision. So the government says that they will argue that sexual labor falls under the statute. And they said that we need to make it clear to the jury that this is a different kind of labor and it falls within labor and services, where the defense says clearly sex trafficking can fall under forced labor. And they kind of pointed to their motion for acquittal argument that they had made just yesterday. And so the judge ended up overruling the government's objection because he said that the concern is that the jury may be confused that sexual services automatically count as laboring services. And so the government will have a chance to kind of argue about this during their summations, aka their closing arguments. And so and there was kind of, just again, the legalese as far as the defense objecting to lines about difficult and compulsory. And they say it goes to mirror what the government argues, that the term labor is sufficient. You don't need to include specially. Again, they're really just kind of making sure that every single word is accurate and perfect for the jury to really kind of understand and really kind of digest it as they're getting all these really kind of like legal jargon, legal words in terms of the instructions that they're going to be eventually given before they are able to deliberate.
Hey there, everybody. So I want to thank Morgan & Morgan for sponsoring this episode of Sidebar. Always love talking about them. Now, here is the incredible thing about Morgan & Morgan, and one of the reasons why I like talking about them so much.
Hey, say something about our big wins.
You're not supposed to come on camera. The reason Morgan & Morgan, America's largest personal injury law firm, is so big, and I'm sure you can guess it, is because they win a lot. And that's
Don't forget huge verdicts.
Yeah, they've won big verdicts. $6.8 million in New York, $26 million in Philadelphia. You see, the thing about them is they don't settle for lowball insurance offers from insurance companies, which is something.
Mention that you can submit a claim from your couch at home and on your phone.
And they've completely modernized the process by submitting your claim, talking to your legal team. It's all done straight from your smartphone. Again, that's something
With
that
8 clicks or less.
8 clicks or less. Yes. You can see if you have a case in just a few minutes.
1,000 lawyers. We have over 1,000 lawyers.
All right.
now.
You know what, Dan? If you really think you can do better, maybe you should just do it yourself.
What Jesse was getting at is if you've ever been injured in an accident, you can check out Morgan & Morgan. You can submit a claim in 8 clicks or less. To start your claim, just visit forthepeople.com/LC sidebar.
You came a little too close to me. It hurt me a little bit. I'm probably actually going to have to hire you guys now, but that was well said. That was well said.
The prosecution delivered their fiery closing argument in the Sean Diddy Combs criminal trial, highlighting why these are episodes of sex trafficking, why the evidence proves Combs operated a criminal enterprise, and how he directed and arranged multiple instances of transporting people for prostitution. We will break down the highlights of this closing argument right now. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Closing arguments are officially underway in the Sean Diddy Combs criminal trial. In fact, the prosecution just wrapped up their closing argument. Remember, this is the last chance for each side to summarize the evidence in this case, present their final conclusion, their narrative for the jury. And it's important. It's important because there's a lot for the jury to consider over these past few weeks. It is a complicated case. There is a lot of evidence. There's a lot of testimony. And closings are the last time the jurors will hear from the attorneys before they begin their deliberations. So we begin with the prosecution's closing argument that was delivered by Assistant United States Attorney Christy Slavic, outlining why the jury should find Combs guilty of 1 count of racketeering conspiracy, 2 counts of sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, 1 with respect to Cassie Ventura Fine, 1 with respect to Jane, and 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution.
on the inside while the outside still shines. Expenses didn't slow when income did. They never do. Private jets don't get cheaper because relevance fades. Mansions don't maintain themselves. Staff doesn't work for loyalty alone. Security doesn't accept reputation as payment. Everything costs, every single day. When revenue disappears, those costs don't disappear with it. They sharpen. The first phase of collapse is denial, quiet confidence that this is temporary, that something will come through, that a deal is almost done, that the past will somehow fund the future. But days pass, then weeks, and nothing arrives. The safety net everyone assumed existed turns out to be imaginary. That's when the mood changes. People stop answering messages, smiles become tense, conversations become shorter. Those who once stayed close suddenly remember other obligations. Loyalty fades faster than money, always has. Influence only exists when backed by leverage. And leverage disappears the moment the numbers hit.
Again, one with respect to Cassie, one with respect to Jane. I want to bring on right now Law and Crimes reporter Elizabeth Milner, who was inside that courtroom for all of those arguments today. Elizabeth, great to see you. Want to take this piece by piece. Let's start it off with racketeering conspiracy. The top charge, arguably the most complicated charge in the mix, carries life in prison. Okay, so there's a lot at stake here. The prosecutor definitely wanted to make it clear for the jury. How did she outline, let's start this, how did she outline that this is a criminal organization, that there was a criminal agreement? Let's start there before we even move into the underlying predicate crimes that the prosecution needs to prove.
Yeah, so right off the bat, Christy Slavic is really talking about count one, of course, that being racketeering conspiracy, aka RICO. And just right off the bat, she's telling the jury, over the last several weeks, you learned about Sean Combs and then kidnapping an employee, forced labor, arson, bribery, plus brutal crimes are at the heart of the case. She also said, across all of these comes the defendant using his power and violence to get what he wants, and that he doesn't take no for an answer. And so right off at the top of her closing argument, the jury has shown exhibit photos, one of March 2016 Intercontinental Hotel still image from that surveillance video where you can kind of see Cassie on the ground after she was initially physically assaulted by Sean Combs on that videotape. And then also the government talked about Sean Combs kicking, choking, and slapping Jane and forcing her into a freak-off, specifically pointing to the instance that happened in June of 2024. And so, the government was like, these instances are separated by 8 years, but they're kind of saying they're one and the same. But I think the most interesting part of just the beginning of the closing argument by the prosecution is that Christy Slavic is like, Sean Combs has a small army of personal staff. No one could stop him. He uses inner circle and money to cover up his crimes, and even referred to his assistants as foot soldiers and other things like that. So really kind of pointing out how the assistants, how those who are in Sean Combs' inner circle really kind of helped build this case of racketeering conspiracy against the defendant.
Yeah, that he's the leader of this criminal organization, that the assistants, the security, they helped pull off the freak-offs. They knew it was wrong. They were the go-to people. They knew about the sex tapes. They got drugs for freak-offs. Christina Coram, she knew what was going on. D-Rock got ice for Cassie's black eye. So I get it, right? This idea that everybody was on the same page. Now, for the prosecution to win this charge, they have to prove at least two underlying predicate crimes, right? And you tell me what stood out the most. Was it forced labor? Was it kidnapping? Was it arson? Which, by the way, there was a whole back and forth yesterday. Oh, is arson and kidnapping still part of the case? Yes, it is. They may have they might have decided to not move forward with attempted arson or attempted kidnapping, but they're still moving forward with actual kidnapping and arson or conspiracy to commit these crimes. So which of the underlying crimes really stood out to you today? I know the prosecution addressed all of them, but was it forced labor? Was it the drug offenses? Was it arson? Was it kidnapping? Was it bribery? Which were the ones that you think if the jury has to decide, oh, these are the two we're going to find them guilty of, or we think these are the predicate crimes for racketeering, this pattern of criminal activity, which were some of the ones that stood out to you?
Well, to your point, Jesse, the prosecution laying out again that the government only has to prove two of these acts, but as they're listing drug distribution, kidnapping, arson, bribery, sex trafficking, forced labor, witness tampering, interstate transportation for prostitution, you really could pick any of them because I feel like the government made very strong cases for all of them. But some of the ones that really kind of stood out to me, and I think for maybe a different way than maybe people think, was kind of drug distribution, because I think a lot of people, in terms of just the drug.
Zero. Behind closed doors, panic sets in, not the dramatic kind, the controlled, suffocating kind, the kind where every decision feels wrong. Sell assets now or wait and lose more, cut staff or bleed slowly, speak publicly or hide and hope. Every option costs something, and there's nothing left to spend. What makes this downfall so severe is how complete it is. There's no backup plan, no emergency fund waiting to be unlocked. Years of excess burned through everything. The assumption that money would never stop flowing was treated like a fact, not a risk, and when that assumption died, it took the entire structure with it. Public perception doesn't change instantly, but it always catches up. First come the rumors, then the reports, then the undeniable signs. Fewer appearances, no new announcements, no visible movement. The absence becomes louder than any statement ever could be. Zero revenue.
Incidents that he had previously included in a lawsuit against Combs, including that he believes Combs drugged him on multiple occasions. He also claims that he worked with Combs for a year on the last album he put out, actually living with Combs during that time. But his allegation is he claims he never got paid for his work. And the documentary included alleged voice messages from Combs where he assured Lil Rod that he would get paid eventually and that he was making a big deal out of nothing. But now I got to talk about the jurors, okay? So we heard from two of the jurors who served on the jury during Combs' federal criminal trial in New York. So Juror 75 and Juror 160. They spoke about the split verdict, with Juror 75 saying, "We saw both sides of it and we came with our conclusion." Juror 160 said that she never felt like Combs was being coercive toward the jury, agreeing that sometimes he would look over at them or nod his head, but saying it didn't seem like he was trying to sway the jury one way or another. There were others in the documentary who claimed that Combs had an entire PR team working outside the courthouse, making sure to speak with bloggers and content creators, pushing their narrative into the public consciousness. The jury, by the way, wasn't sequestered during the trial. Some in the docuseries wondered if, despite their best efforts, they could have been influenced improperly by the discourse going on around them. But Elizabeth, these two jurors speaking out there, what stood out to you about their comments? And does anything that they say, in your opinion, affect the verdict?
Yeah, so this was so fascinating. You very rarely hear from jurors talking publicly, especially about such a high-profile trial like this, and especially on camera. So I think that was a real coup for them to be able to get these two jurors to come on camera. I think it spoke to two things we saw in the trial. So the first juror, who's a younger female juror, had talked about, I think, the issue of what she saw as lack of credibility or the evidence that was being presented. So one of the things that she talked about was when Capricorn Clark, who had worked for Diddy for a number of years, came on the stand. She had talked about, her allegations were that she was kidnapped, that she was forced to go with Diddy when Diddy allegedly wanted to, commit physical harm upon Kid Cudi. And one of the things that the juror had said was that she found some credibility issues with Capricorn Clark, that her testimony was overly emotional, but she was testifying to things that happened a decade ago. So it goes to sort of the issue of credibility. And also one of the things that she had said was, that video of him and Cassie in the hallway was devastating, but domestic violence, DV, was not one of the charges. So I think it kind of spoke to the issue that some of the jurors had of, jurors love black and white evidence. They love videos, they love photos, they love sort of that being caught red-handed moment. So if DV was one of the charges, obviously I think he would have been convicted just based on that video. But I think she kind of spoke to the issue of, at least in the jurors' eyes, and what we saw from the verdict was, where was that evidence of coercion in terms of trafficking, sort of that physical evidence? At least they didn't see it from what the verdict appeared. And then the other juror, who was an older gentleman, had talked about the nature of the relationship between Cassie and Diddy. And I thought that was really fascinating, because one of the things he had said was, we heard testimony from her about how difficult this relationship was, but she kept going back. So one of the things he had said was, if you don't like something, you get out. And I think that kind of speaks to maybe the difficulty that some of the jurors had of understanding the nuance between two people in this kind of volatile relationship. I know, the trial had experts to come and testify about the emotional ways that can play out, but I think that spoke to two themes: the nature of the evidence, and then also difficulty in kind of understanding the back and forth relationship and why Cassandra Ventura would go back given how she was being treated.
Well, we say all this to say it's not surprising that Sean Combs and his team are not happy about this, okay? Which
doesn't just affect finances. It destroys power dynamics. Lawsuits feel heavier. Negotiations turn hostile. People stop fearing consequences because there's nothing left to threaten them with. Once weakness is exposed, pressure comes from every direction. This is where the image fractures. For years, the image was everything: confidence, control, excess, success, the idea that nothing could touch the empire. But image requires maintenance, and maintenance requires money. Without revenue, the illusion collapses faster than anyone expects. The gap between perception and reality becomes impossible to hide. Properties become liabilities instead of trophies. Brands turn into burdens. Everything once used to project dominance now drains what little remains. The very things that defined success become reminders of how far the fall has gone. Because once people see the money is gone, they stop believing in the story. Zero revenue means no protection. Legal pressure feels heavier. Public scrutiny cuts deeper. There's no longer a buffer to absorb damage. Every hit lands directly, and hits start coming from everywhere once weakness is exposed. This is the part no one talks about. The part after the headlines fade. The part where the reality settles in and there's nowhere left to run. No spin, no distraction, no escape. Just consequences. The downfall wasn't sudden. It was inevitable. The signs were there long before the numbers hit zero. But denial is powerful when money is still flowing. Once it stops, the truth arrives all at once. The empire is gone, not because someone took it, but because it was never as stable as it claimed to be. When the revenue died, everything else followed. Influence, power, control, all of it. This is what total financial collapse looks like. Not dramatic, not glamorous, just silence where money used to be, and a future that suddenly feels very, very small.